I'm going to start with my standard disclaimer, which is I'm currently on leave from Google. I'm working on the transition, and that means that everything I'm about to say is my own personal opinion, not reflective in any way of the views or opinions of the transition or anybody working on it. So we are very fortunate to have a really interesting panel of people from different angles, or looking from different angles on the problem of open government and participatory government. Those are the two themes that we're going to try to unpack and brainstorm about. I'm going to start off with brief introductions. You can all use the search engine of your choice to do more background research on the panelists, so I won't spend too much time on it. I'll start on the far right with Chris Barkley, who had to do a lot of heavy lifting to make sure that there was no legislation pending today that might otherwise keep him busy and away from our panel. He works for Senator Coburn, where he focuses on budget and appropriations. He was formerly on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee in the Senate, where in 2006, he, with his boss, Senator Coburn, and their co-sponsor, Senator Obama, put together a bill that it was popularly known as the Google for Government bill, which we will be asking him about. Meredith Fuchs is General Counsel at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, where she does open government, FOIA, and Federal Records Act litigation, among many other things. She's a regular auditor of the federal government and testifier before Congress and federal agencies, and one of the most respected experts on open government in Washington. Karina Newton is Director of New Media for Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She's been with the Speaker since 2001 and oversees communications with online and new media, and runs the Speaker.gov website, which has won various and sundry awards. Among other things, she's gotten Speaker Pelosi to be a chatter, a blogger, a digger, and Lord knows what else. And finally, John, is it Wonderlich? Wonderlich, because it would be Wonderlich in another language. Is a program director for the Sunlight Foundation, which is one of the most innovative and active foundations in the area of open government that has really come to prominence in the last year. He runs an open house project, the Open Senate project, and his background is in philosophy. So the really hard, thorny metaphysical questions will go to John. So let me just start off with a kind of a baseline question, which is, can we just go down the line, and I'd like everyone to tell the audience what your understanding of openness is. When you think about open government, what does that actually mean, and what do you think the correct objective for the next administration in the area of openness should be? John, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks. I think there's a lot of ways of going about attacking that question. But I work for the Sunlight Foundation, and one of our biggest focuses is the fact that technology is enabling us to create more open government. So a lot of things have changed over the last 100 years or 200 years since our democracy started, but one of the things that's changed most significantly in the last 10 years is how we communicate with each other. So insofar as our public sphere has become something that exists online, an easy way to talk about open government is to say that our definition of what public means should be that public means government documents are posted online. Public should no longer mean that documents are kept in a binder in a basement, or if you think about it, the Federal Depository Library Program is sort of like the internet of the 40s and 50s and everything before the internet was there. And so government needs to recognize that how we communicate has changed and catch up with that.
I think openness in government is primarily a belief. I think that, members of Congress, because of, from my perspective, they all have individual levels of disclosure. And I think that there are some standard levels of disclosure that have to do with FCC, et cetera, FEC rather. There is a personal commitment on that. I think in addition to that, it's about format. As John said, it's not about PDFs, it's about XML. So looking at the way in which data is available along a spectrum of access.
Well, I would certainly agree with what the other speakers have said, but I would go one step further to say, right now, there's a lot of information that's available on government websites, but there's a lot of information that isn't available on government websites, and that's the kind of information that's really going to tell you whether the agencies and the executive branch are doing things well. That's the information that has to do with accountability, and this touches on the question from the last panel about, is it enough to put an event on the web? It's not enough to put an event on the web. You've got to go further. You've got to look for the hard decisions, the records that agencies are not on their own deciding to make available to you, but the ones that people are asking for and fighting to get. And so accountability, to me, would be a huge part of open government.
From our perspective, we've been of the philosophy that not only should information be available, but that it should be available somewhat easily. One of the things that we were striving for, and we developed this bill with then Senator Obama, was we kept calling it the Google for Government bill. We hoped that Google wouldn't be offended, and I guess by my presence here today that
To unleash our hordes of litigation lawyers on you.
We were hoping to, in some way, emulate the idea that you can go on to a website, type in a single search function, and pull up data that you think is relevant to the topic that you're looking for. And that's what Google does, and so we figured, why not bring that to government information? And so that was what we then were trying to do and still are trying to do. And so we are hoping that you can get it easily. We wanted, when we did this bill, we said you can't just bury this in the back of some OMB webpage. You have to make it its own website so that you can find it easily. And, like Meredith said, there's a lot of information that's out there, but a lot of it's not easily searchable. A lot of it's not easily accessible. And so we think that it should be not only there, but reachable to regular people.
Meredith, can I ask you to describe some of the barriers and obstacles that confront the realization of the objective that you just laid out? And then to structure this a little bit, could I ask Chris and Karina, just from the Hill perspective, to give your take on that and how you think those can be overcome? And then John, in your innovative thinking capacity, can you talk about how you would overcome some of those?
Well, to me, the main obstacle is the mess that's being left behind, not just by the outgoing administration, but by all the outgoing administration, or all the past administrations. I mean, one of the big challenges in terms of making information more accessible to the public, using the internet to reach the public, is going to be the fact that most agencies have absolutely no way of managing their electronic information. The records are not saved. They're not saved in a way that you can ever find them. I mean, hopefully you've heard that the White House has lost 5 million emails from a period when we were going to war in Iraq. So this is a huge problem, and that mess is going to have to be cleaned up, and there have to be better practices, and I'm hopeful that Congress is going to put a little more pressure on the agencies and the White House to actually keep the records. Once you come up with that, then you can start actually trying to reach the public. And again, you're going to have a challenge identifying what the public wants and needs. I understand the White House, when Clinton left, the electronic records were something like 3 terabytes of information. And now they're estimating it's going to be 100 terabytes of information coming out of the Bush White House. So this is a lot of information that's going to have to be made accessible.
Karina, could I ask a sort of a related question, which is, are there things that the speaker would like to be doing or that you personally would like to see the House doing that run up against statutes or policies or practices that where that basically stop you from doing things you'd like to be able to do online?
Well, this year we actually had a major breakthrough with franking reforms in the House, and we had, the franking reforms were written predominantly before the internet. And so they had rules on basically franking is meant to protect taxpayer dollars, so it's 100% a valuable idea. And so essentially anything that was produced on the government dime by government staff had to go through the Franking Commission. And it's a little bit of a process to make sure, they're not using party identifiers, they're not saying inappropriate things using taxpayer money. So they applied the franking regulations to websites. However, there were things like your picture can't be more than 3 inches by 2 inches. What does that mean for a website? There was a translation issue. And another item on the franking regulations was that you couldn't post outside the House firewall. So this prevented members of Congress from using things like YouTube. So up until last month, when we had the franking regulations approved, every member who was doing anything outside of the House firewall was technically not following franking regulations. This was about half of our caucus, the speaker among them. So, this is a great change, and I think because of the franking regulation changes, you are going to see members of Congress using the internet and Web 2.0 tools in ways that they haven't.
Chris, do you have on your legislative agenda or your sort of legislative to-do list open government items for the next Congress?
Yeah, we introduced a bill along with actually then Senator Obama. Gotta start getting that right. President-elect Obama introduced a bill last year that we were the chief co-sponsor on to strengthen the usaspending.gov website. And so that's something we'd like to see carried forth again this year. And basically what the gist of that bill was to take the website that we already have and to add more detail to it, to deepen the amount of data that you can get, to make it more easily searchable, to strengthen the website generally. And so we have every intention of getting that bill reintroduced this year. We are extremely excited about this connection that we have with President-elect Obama, and we think that there's no reason to think that we won't get something done in that regard, and it's a good thing, I think, in general. We're pretty hopeful for.
Can I just add on that too? It's over the course of especially the 110th Congress, language about putting things online has been included in many more bills. So on the financial rescue package, or others call it the bailout, transactions had to be put online within 48 hours. So you see it in a lot more legislation where both the quality of what's being disclosed and the way in which it's being disclosed and the timeliness is being incorporated in bills that you never would have seen before.
So, John, from the side of kind of innovative use of technology to achieve some of these things or overcome some of these obstacles, what looks interesting to you? What recommendations would you make?
Well, I would say I agree with everything that's been said. I especially focused in on when Meredith was talking about the records management issue, which certainly is a huge issue, especially in the executive branch, where electronic digital records management is basically non-existent and unenforced. So it's a matter of managing records. It's also a matter of personnel. If you don't have people in important positions that believe in open government and truth and competence and science, then your technology is going to suffer as a result. So I would definitely say it's also based on personnel. And then the last thing, and I think this gets to Karina's point about the franking reform, is that in order to have good technology policy in Congress or in the executive branch, we have to change we have to change the way that we think about technology authority. So jurisdiction across the government and within Congress also is really splintered and doesn't exactly make sense, and there's all this negotiated terrain of who's responsible for what. And that's something that's so excited about the CTO's office, is that that Obama has proposed, and we're all watching very closely to see what comes of that. And what's exciting about that is that responsibility for technological decisions will be centralized, and then agency databases that are splintered and might have 25 different ways of saying the same thing will suddenly work together. And then the data will work together so that people can get access to the information of influence or the information that they need to participate in government.
Chris?
I just wanted to pick up on the idea of what the obstacles are going to be as far as getting legislation done. And I think one of the interesting aspects of this that most people don't maybe think about on a regular basis is that Congress is actually, I think, one of the biggest obstacles to getting any legislation done. Clearly, this is where the legislation begins and ends, and this is where we have the folks who have a vested interest oftentimes in keeping things from the public. Because it's been interesting as we've been moving forward on implementing websites and asking for information. It's oftentimes the career staff that are helpful to us at the agencies, and sometimes even the politicals. But it's really been some of the vested members of Congress who really don't want some of this information to get out and have really tried to put a squash in some of the legislation. You even look at something like the Congressional Research Service. They produce all kinds of wonderful reports, and people have had a lot of attempts to try and get these made public. And whether that's a good or a bad idea for different reasons, I think it's just indicative that we have a research services producing high-quality reports for Congress, but yet the website is entirely closed off to the public. And so, I think unless there's a mind shift in Congress itself, it's going to be harder to get the legislation through.
Well, and I just want to add that the good news is some of these changes could happen by executive order by the new president. So we don't have to wait for Congress to work it out. I mean, there are some changes that a new administration can put in place, not only by issuing executive orders that direct agencies to do this right and do it better, but by appointing people to positions who care about these issues, and Congress at the confirmation hearings asking questions and getting them on record for caring about these issues. Because we've always seen in the open government area that when you appoint people at the head of agencies who recognize that they should be accountable, that the agencies do a better job.
So let me shift the discussion to participation a little bit. The question I want to raise is what I thought was the thorniest one that got raised at the last panel. And it's one that interests me because of how many different how confused the discussion become very quickly, depending on whether you have a theory of what participation is supposed to achieve for a government agency. And what I mean by that is, you can imagine participation being aimed at improving government decision-making. You can imagine it being aimed at making people feel better about their government. You can imagine it as being a way to achieve a sort of a safety valve where you could pick up data that you might otherwise miss, small numbers of people in an agency, large numbers of people contributing. Anyway, there's lots of different ways to think about what the value of participation, public participation in government process is. And then the really thorny question is, when is it just a kind of a feel-good maneuver that makes people happy, and when is it actually contributing to the work of government? And so, in no particular order, could you please address, that, sort of what you think the right objective for participation in the next administration should be, and how you think about the right objectives or the right orientation for that?
I think that the first thing to think about there is that we don't know. We don't know what all the benefits are of a more participatory government, because we haven't tried it yet. And every time it's tried, we discover things about how it works. So if you look at the Peer-to-Patent project, that was a project done with the Patent Office where people could submit research before the patent examiners got to the patents, and you could submit prior art beforehand. And that was only possible because they gave a special kind of access to citizen examiners beforehand. And that turned out to be a really, really successful project, and is so far been successful and is helping the Patent Office to work through some of their backlog of patents waiting to be examined, and is probably going to expand to other aspects of the agencies, to other parts of the Patent Office. But I think, so that's point number one, is that we don't know what's going to happen, but it's important to experiment with it, and we should err on the side of experimenting with technology in government, because the downside is minimal. And the other point I'd like to make is that sort of participation is only possible through public access to information. So we have a little bit of ways to go before we get to really meaningful participation. And in the meantime, you're totally right that you have to be on the lookout for transparency theater, which is a sort of feel good, like, look, we're participating. So that's certainly something that we're looking for.
Can I press you just a little bit, because I just want to throw this out as a sort of a challenge, and I'm not sure what the right answer is, but peer-to-patent seems very interesting to me because there is an objective question for which public participation can help supply the objectively correct answer. In other words, the question there is, was this the invention, or did something earlier constitute the invention? And if you can show an objective patent that exists, if you show a patent that existed before this one was filed, then you're in luck. But it's a very objective question. Government often has to look at questions like, should the death penalty be legal for this particular crime, or be applied to this particular crime, for which there's no real objective answer. And I think one of the problems that was alluded to in the earlier panel is, this basic problem that online mechanisms tend to be very easily gamed. I mean, there's this famous example of, Time magazine asking for readers to vote on the greatest artist, greatest political leader, greatest military general in about 12 different categories. And at the end of their process, the winner in every single category was Kemal Ataturk. It shows you what the sort of limits are when you try to, do sort of crude online ways of evaluating opinion. And frankly, much of what government tries to do is neither purely objective nor totally values driven, but very much in between, like should the retirement age for Social Security be 65 or 67? And it happens in a complex matrix of trade-offs. So anyway, from the work you've been doing, one answer, I suppose, is just start somewhere and start to build these things out and see what happens. But, how do you respond to a challenge like that?
Well, I think it's a bit of a straw man to say that participatory democracy or participation online is designed to create direct democracy. I don't think anybody's saying that patent examiners should lose their power or anything like that. And I think it's also important to note that substance flows both ways online. So when change.gov posts the original copies of transition recommendations that they receive, it's not just that they might see some suggestion that the drafters of the document forgot to point out or get a really good way of describing a contradiction that's contained there, but it's also that the public receives the feedback from the transition team. So if you think about it, it's kind of a shame that previous transitions tended to be these rooms full of experts where the best thinkers on topics would meet and talk to them, and then the ideas would die there, or maybe some of them would see the light of day. But what change.gov has done is made sort of a vital place for these ideas to have a public life. And whether the 3,000 or 5,000, probably 6,000 by today, comments that you get on the healthcare discussion are valuable or not, we'll see if ideas come out of that. I think we've already seen some compelling examples of ideas submitted to change.gov getting a life of their own about solar power generation in space or whatever it is. There's some neat ideas that have been there. Whether substance comes out of that that's really usable all the time, that's yet to be seen, but I think it's valuable because of things that the government might miss and also because of what the public can learn from it. And just one last thing I'd like to point out is it's not unusual that the government misses the obvious or things that they should have known. So back to the Patent Office example, there was a judge that was appointed to adjudicate some sort of Patent Office issue, and I'm not sure what it was, but over the course of maybe Meredith could say, but it was 5 years this judge was there, and a constitutional law professor at, was it Georgetown? Do you know the story? He noticed that the way this patent judge was put into power was unconstitutional, and he wrote an article about it. And then after he noticed this, everybody in Congress and everybody at the Patent Office said, you know what, you're right. It's unconstitutional, and we have to invalidate all the work that this judge has been doing for years, and it's a mess now because all these patent decisions are wrong. And so my question is, why didn't that realization that the process was unconstitutional happen? There are constitutional law experts and people that should realize this, but they were so divorced from the process that it took some professor 5 years later to notice it, and now we have to clean up all the waste that came from it.
Meredith?
Well, I would say that it's true that there's a big challenge on whether getting a lot of people to have input is going to make a difference or not. I mean, for example, we have something in this country called notice and comment rulemaking. Agencies publish proposed rules, people get to comment on them, and now that those are generally published online and comments can be submitted online, advocacy groups all the time send out alerts to their folks and say, write in. And so, the agency gets 1 million emails from an environmental constituency, let's say. Do they give them any weight or not? It's hard to know because they might get, 5 good comments that are much more detailed, and those are the ones that they really pay attention to. So you definitely run the risk that the volume is just going to lead them to be ignored. But having said that, I think if we had a better way of understanding what the government's doing, what the decisions are, then the constituencies are going to begin to fall into place, and we're going to reach audiences that aren't being reached today. So I would agree with John that I think we sort of have to start trying it, and then we have to see how it plays out. And part of it is to allow those communities with interest in issues to know so they can have a voice and raise the kinds of points that John is saying, things that the government officials haven't thought of, things that might actually help make better decisions.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Just on the notion of participatory government and whether this model is working and how to improve it. One of the interesting things, and I hate to be a Johnny One Note because we had so much experience with this, creating this website with the Coburn Obama USA Spending.gov. But I will say one of the really interesting anecdotes that came out of that was that we thought that the best way to pass this legislation was going to be quietly, just, don't draw a lot of attention to it. It's not that interesting anyway. And since there are folks who would probably want to kill an open government piece of legislation, why not just see if it'll kind of go in the back corner somewhere. And lo and behold, one senator ended up putting a hold on it and blocking the legislation, and it sparked a whole firestorm on the blogosphere, which ended up creating folks from the right and the left. We had folks from redstate.com and folks from Daily Kos lining up together to out who this one senator was, and they were posting lists online, and they were communicating back and forth. And because of them, I really would give them full credit for passing this thing into law. And if it hadn't been for this united effort out there that wouldn't have existed without for the blogosphere, you wouldn't have got an actual piece of legislation passed. So it's an interesting example of participatory government that works. I don't know if there's a perfect example yet as far as how constituents interact with their members yet, but it's developing.
Just a quick addition to that. I do think that no matter what, we have to try and see what works. And for every member, every member represents a different district. Internet access may be, 20% in one member's district and 80% in another member's district, but you have to find, those niches in which you can communicate. And I also think as representatives are responsible directly to their constituents, it's a really great, internet technologies are great tools for immediate response. Whether the speaker did something with students that were at SF State and they were talking about global warming, and she did a webcast basically, and she wanted to hear what they were doing, what their thoughts were. It was something that could be set up in a very quick, short time period. And getting response directly from people, not just through online polls, which have been done for almost a decade now, but more of that face-to-face interaction where she can't fly 3,000 miles to hear what her constituents say right then and there.
Let's turn to some of the Google moderator questions that came in. I'm going to rephrase the first one just slightly. It's a good question, but I'm assuming that not everybody knows what the budgeting system in Porto Alegre, Brazil is. So let me ask a slightly different variation on this question, which is, do you have an example or two of really innovative uses of technology for openness or participation that you're a fan of? Something that you look at as sort of a model of how to get this right in the next administration? Anybody want to jump on that, John?
My Society is a British charity, they call it nonprofit, and they've made a whole suite of websites that enable civic participation. One of my favorite ones is a site called fixmystreet.com, and what they did was figured out every parish or district, whatever it's called, and then got a list of every phone number or email address, it would be email address, for every problem, and then connected that to a mapping application. And so if you have a pothole or an abandoned car or whatever your problem is, you put in your address and you put in the problem, and they connect you to the right official. And all you need is a couple of pieces of standardized data, and then suddenly they're the recognized source for that. And it's amazing how many submissions they get, and you can track the progress online and click on the little thing and see that the abandoned car has now been towed away from your street. So I think that's just waiting to be built in the United States.
Anybody else want to volunteer? No. Chris?
Well,
I was just say, I actually, my wife and I just bought a house this past month, and one of the ways that we were doing some research was we looked at a website called crimereports.com, and it's sort of a similar thing where the Montgomery County Police Department submitted reports to this website, and they just dotted all over. I think it actually used a Google Maps function for that. But they just dotted the crime incidents, whether it was something simple like a vandalism or something more serious. But you could see where the clusters of crime were, and you could get a sense of where you might or might not want to move.
I think the way that works, by the way, is all that Montgomery does is just publish data in a standardized format. The website Crime Reports grabs the data and puts it up. It's one of the examples that I think is pretty prominent in what can happen if you just simply make the data available. Other people figure out what to do with it.
And the DC government right now is doing a really interesting project where they basically put everything, and developers are building APIs and and I think it's a brilliant thing. And government can't do everything. And I think My Society, that particular one was built by someone. Do you know who built it?
I'm not sure.
Sure.
I think it was the My Society team. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So basically harnessing the creativity of others who can see the data and see how they can translate it. Government doesn't have to do everything.
Next question. This is a who question. So who, CTO, Congress, et cetera, who should take the leadership role in pushing and enabling government to become more open?
I'd be happy to start. I mean, I would like President Obama to take a leadership role in pushing the government to be more open and transparent by, right away stating that that's what he expects from his administration. So after that, I would like Congress to have oversight hearings and to make sure the agencies are actually putting that into practice. And I would like Congress to pass some legislation. I think that Congress has to make clear that the information that the government has belongs to the people, and it should be accessible to the people, and there shouldn't be obstructions that interfere with the people getting access to it. So I would sort of put it in that order.
Practical suggestion that it be put into the Office of Management and Budget. From my experience in government, when OMB issues a directive, people are much more likely to react to it than they are if it comes from somewhere else.
That's sort of an office debate we have at Sunlight all the time. It's like, we should have a betting pool because we talk about it so much, is whether the CTO will be a cabinet level sort of position or a White House office or become an office within OMB. And I think all those options have benefits and risks involved. But it's a great suggestion.
I think there's also some jurisdiction with GPO, Government Printing Office, who's responsible for making it public.
I mean, one of the issues with this idea about having a chief transparency officer is that what happens in agencies right now is the people who are involved with the technology are not sort of the content owners of the information. So there's not any communication between the people who are dealing with the technology and the people who care or don't care about whether the public gets information. A chief transparency officer or chief technology officer who has transparency within their realm is someone who would be able to actually marry those two concepts and make a difference.
Why don't we go to the microphones if there are people with questions? Go right ahead.
Hello, my name is Mark Elbert. I'm the web manager for the Energy Information Administration, and formerly for Peace Corps. And I can tell you that a lot of federal managers are trying to do some of the things you're saying, but we're actually held back. Such things as if we want to do a customer survey, simply we have to submit every question through OMB clearance, which can take up to 6 months. The use of cookies has to be approved by a secretary-level approval, which is to say it's not going to happen. What is the recognition, particularly from Karina and Chris in Congress, about the restrictions, and is there any move afoot to unleash the government to let us do the things that you're advocating? Thank you.
Great question.
I would say from my end, we don't often get the perspective of what's going on inside of the agencies, and so it's somewhat difficult for us to get through the political barrier sometimes to hear what's really going on. So, I don't know if there's any specific legislative movement right now to address that particular issue, but I think that, we sense that frustration. We would love to do something about it. I think that there's sort of been efforts to take steps to make information more transparent. But as far as allowing decisions to be pushed below the secretary level, sometimes that can be rather difficult. But I think that putting, like Meredith said, putting the right people at OMB, can really have a large effect on setting the tone from the top. And once you get inside there and get in that mentality and start issuing directives, it really has a strong, powerful effect as far as my experience has been.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know exactly what the legislative angle would be, but I think that I would also put money, although I have no personal knowledge of the Obama team looking at that very item. I'm sure that they're going to want to do things that haven't been done by the current administration using cookies, et cetera. So
I would just say that the National Academy of Public Administration has undertaken a systematic review of all the barriers to Web 2.0, and that's that sort of implementation in government. So there's the Federal Advisory Committee Act or the Paperwork Reduction Act or all sorts of different things that get in the way. And that has been done in conjunction with a lot of federal web managers, and I know that NAPA has connected the transition team. So I would assume that they're very much aware of it, but hopefully they're hearing those concerns. I've seen a lot of conversation about those exact things.
Let's go to the mic in the center, please.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Zook, and I'm with the Association for Competitive Technology. We all had to read Democracy in America in high school, and de Tocqueville was worried about the level of sort of white noise that even the print media would generate to make it impossible for people to participate in democracy. And I wonder what he would think about 80 terabytes of information coming out of government and what the actual practical implications of that might be. It could be that the notion of public participation and openness is going to have to be far more rigorous than the availability of information and actually come to boiling down information and providing information specifically for the purpose of participation. And I guess another question related to Andrew's question earlier is that If everyone self-selects into the participation process, I think any pollster will tell you that's not going to be a very accurate reflection of what the public believes either. So I mean, there's a lot of kumbaya in the room, but I think there's some really hardcore challenges, I think, to actual open participation in government.
Yeah, Meredith?
I think those are very, very important points. And I will say, though, I think there are some things that we can look to for hope. For instance, we have a law in this country called the Freedom of Information Act. And people have made requests for 40 years under the Freedom of Information Act. And those are people who care about things. And I'll tell you, the things that the American public are interested in are incredibly varied. I mean, maybe those up here in this panel care about OLC memos about torture, but there's someone else who cares about, you know, the conditions in the water, and they're going to the Coast Guard to get those records. So there are things that agencies can do to figure out what people care about right away. Now, maybe that's not going to solve all the problem, but they can start there. And there's actually a law that was called the Electronic Freedom of Information Act that requires agencies to put up information that people ask for frequently. I would like to see agencies go beyond that, not wait for the questions, but say, you know, they want the contracts. So we should be putting these contracts up there. We don't have to wait till they ask for it, or whatever the things are. So it's not a complete mess, even though it's a lot of information. There's some things agencies can do right away to get started to figure this out.
I would say one of the things that we found is that government isn't very good maybe at packaging the information for someone's specific use, but what they are good at, and they should be good at, is making it, well, they're not good at it, but the one thing that they can be good at is making it available. And so the way we've sort of envisioned this is, let's try to throw as much as we can against the wall, and then depend on folks on the outside to take that and package it for people who actually want it. That's not maybe ideal in the long run, but I think that there's some merit to say, well, you know what, let's just take everything we've got, open it up, and then we have constituencies out there, at least that have it available, so they can turn it into whatever they want.
I'd say also on that white noise element, there's a lot of added value that government can bring to information. And I think someone on the earlier panel was talking about, you know, how media, traditional media bloggers, everything's moving in and out. But one of the things that you see now is if you read the paper on the Washington Post and you're reading about, say, the auto bill last night, they're going to be linking to the Senate vote. They're going to be linking to the text of the legislation. There's a lot more intersection of information that's now available. And something that we haven't talked much about our duty to inform and educate our constituents, but that's a huge role of government. And I think that what these technologies are now also doing is adding value to information by contextualizing. For just as a kind of example to bring it back down, you know, when we have our current legislation pages, we have a summary, which is obviously a little bit slated towards a message component, you know, what the speaker feels about the legislation and what it is, but we link to the bill text. After it passes, we link to the roll call vote. We have the video, floor speech video. So we try and have as much information as possible and accessible, because that added value helps take you out of the white noise and gives you context as to what's happening.
So if Jonathan had a follow-up question, he might say, what you all just said is all very well and good on the openness side, but on the participation side, where it's not government data going out, but rather data coming into government, the white noise problem seems to be a fairly serious one, right? Knowing what weight to place on, you know, 1 million emails that all say the same thing versus the 5 which are very substantive is a very thorny problem. It's something you deal with on the Hill all the time, right? Your offices will, I'm sure, have a week go by where nobody emails, and then another week go by where you get, you know, 500,000.
There's no week that goes by without
nobody
emails.
I see. Okay. Anyway, so let's go to this mic over here.
Sure. This is in some ways a follow-up, I think, to that. So my name's Joe Goldman. I work for a nonprofit called America Speaks. And you know, for the past many years, we've been working on how to bring very large, diverse groups of citizens to come together to influence policymaking. And you know, my experience is that when we've experimented with doing that through online mediums, it's been very hard for that to actually have a significant impact on a governor, a state legislature, a city council, a mayor, because it doesn't have the same kind of visceral impact of 1,000 people in a room, that kind of thing. And so I'm wondering, especially for those of you on the Hill, what is the character of participation that could take place online that would make your bosses actually take notice on healthcare reform, on Social Security, whatever the policy issue is? Is it the diversity of participation? Is it the quantity? I mean, what are the characteristics that actually make it influential in terms of public input to you on policymaking?
I think that's a really great question, because that's kind of a challenge for us to figure out. That I guess when I think of what most influences us, I mean, I'd still say that there's a tendency to go towards those who are most organized, and that's just maybe a human tendency. But I still would say that there have been plenty of times when we've found just the quality of the substance of information. I mean, there are times when I, would just sort of be trolling blog sites that are on this certain topic, and I don't know, you look under the blog post and you see 0 comment, 0 comment, 0 comment. You wonder, does anybody read this site? This guy's actually pretty smart. So I'd say that the content of the policy still carries some weight, but I'd still say it tends towards the most organized, but I think that is changing somewhat.
I can really only speak for my office personally, but we kind of crowdsource. The Speaker daily asks for a blog report, which is kind of a summary of what's happening on the blogs, leans towards traditional blogs, but she also looks at what conservative blogs are doing. We have an email list, a call list, basically shows how many number of calls pro, con on the major issues. And then there's also a report on kind of internet activity, so what people are searching for when they come to our website, what they're clicking on. That gives us some kind of indication, and a lot of that is just for our own communications purposes, because we actually use Google Trends a lot too. We were calling one of our issue pages a subprime crisis, and at some point the lexicon moved to foreclosure crisis because it was no longer about subprime, it was about foreclosures. And so that's an indication where we know where both our message and feedback along those lines. Other members, I think they really do care what's coming in. Daniel Bennett, who was standing up before, has been looking at a lot of communications issues just in terms of the mass mailing issue. And that is a real problem, both on staff level, tech-wise, and I think in order for that information to be valuable, there does need to be a more systematic way of looking at incoming communication so that it's not in some massive database not being looked at.
Let's move to the mic on the left, please.
Hi, I'm Celia Wexler. I'm with Union of Concerned Scientists. And I have a couple of questions. One has to do with FOIA and whether you think it would be a good idea if someone made a FOIA request and maybe there was the provision that you could waive fees. So we're not talking about commercial requesters. And you could opt and have that, once that information was FOIA'd and available, it would be available to all. So you wouldn't have to duplicate efforts. We really, we've been working with openness folks on that kind of a policy. And I guess the second part of this is, how do you get agencies to move into the 21st century? One of the problems we have is agencies coming back to us and saying, oh, we can't do this website, it'll cost us $20 million. And we hope that a chief technology officer or the right technical folks might be able to sort of communicate with agencies and give them a more realistic idea of what is involved. One of the problems is that they redact so much. It takes a lot of staff time. Perhaps there's a wonderful technology about redaction, that would save time, but we'd really like to see that. And the third thing is we'd really like to see Congress open up committee votes and markups. If you're not in the room, you don't know what happens to that piece of legislation, and a heck of a lot happens at a markup. So those are questions and asks.
Thank you. Responses?
So in Britain, they have such a system. Again, it's built by My Society, and you can submit a FOIA request there, and then when it comes, it's available to everyone. So that's been built in that context. It doesn't work that well here because the requirement to reply digitally, it doesn't exist or is unenforced. I'm not sure which. So that won't work here until there's an electronic FOIA response requirement.
Well, I would just say, one of my organization's fantasies for a long time has been what we call the electronic archive in the sky that would indeed include everything that anyone's ever asked for under FOIA. It's one of the things we try to create with the records that we request. I mean, we file 2,000 FOIA requests a year. We get thousands of documents. We publish as much as we can, but this is something the government should be doing at some point. And I think that there have been, some of the challenges have been touched on, but I think, the main challenge is that the government is not in the 21st century. That, when you can have a White House that loses 5 million emails, simply because they switched from one email system to another email system, you gotta wonder. And this is not 30 years ago, this is 8 years ago. So I think that having some understanding of technology and trying to actually use it to increase transparency, openness, accountability is gonna be the goal. We can't just have the technology without understanding why we wanna use it and how we wanna use it.
And just on that last point too, on markups and votes, it's a committee by committee level, but 2 years ago, not all committees were webcasting, and now every single committee is webcasting. I think archiving video is the next step. So it's, some committees are doing, some aren't, and some committees are posting votes. So we'd like to see that a little more systemized, but that effort is certainly underway on the House side.
Yeah, another thing, we think the House tend to do a better job than the Senate as far as transparency of their proceedings, especially in committee. One of the things we'd like to see would be maybe transcripts of committee markups, video archives, like you said, even roll call votes published online. If you go to certain committees, they don't even publish anything online. They only have hard copies that you can pick up at the actual committee or the document room. And so this is just unacceptable. I mean, this is the 21st century. We've got to be able to have this stuff online. It counts, a vote is a vote, and so people should know about it.
So what does it take to make that happen?
Well, unfortunately, right now, a lot of these rules are made committee by committee. And so unless there's a change in the House or the Senate rules on these particular aspects, it's going to take somewhat of a public outcry, I think, to get the members themselves to change their minds about how they operate themselves, because they like to make rules for other people to follow, but the institution itself is fairly resistant. So.
Let's go to the center mic.
Good. I have an idea about how to get the public outcry. My name is Linda Moore. I'm speaking totally as a private citizen because I work for Congressional Research Service, and I'm not speaking for CRS. And I'm glad you like our reports. And I would like to see them made public too, off the record. This is what I am thinking about. The Obama administration is going to start posting bills online and seeking comments. Most of the bills, by the time they would get to that point, have already possibly gotten past the point of no return. We have a lot of unintended consequences in bills. By the way, I work for science and technology. I do wireless and radio frequency spectrum policy. Congress is extremely ignorant about technology in many areas. They rely a lot on lobbyists. It would be fantastic if these bills got out early on so the unintended consequences could be caught by a much more savvy public. I would hope that you might consider passing a law, and the people upstairs at CRS, actually they're downstairs, would kill me, but I think CRS could do some of this for you, because we already have a bill digest, and we could start classifying the bill digest instead of by number, by category, by area of where the bills are. And we help you guys deal with constituent letters. We could start dealing with responses that came in, because we are cross-jurisdictional and nonpartisan. So I think this is a fantastic, exciting idea, and I hope that that was a helpful comment, and I'd love to hear further feedback. Thank you.
On that too, I think you're going to see a lot of technology meeting the message and the medium on that. Senator Durbin had some tech policy-oriented legislation that he posted. They had discussions on red state and on open left, and I think you're going to see that more, particularly with tech legislation first. Sunlight Foundation has publicmarkup.org that basically also has title by title listings of the bills where you can comment from there. And I think Representative Honda's office also did a similar thing with the bill. So I think you're going to see those starting to happen on a more regular basis.
And then in addition to putting the bills online for commentary, there's kind of the point about institutionalizing technological expertise. And it's really a shame that the Office of Technology Assessment, which was really a staple from, I don't know when it started, but it was defunded in 1995 when Gingrich came into power. And so that left members of Congress who aren't typically the most technological or scientifically savvy people at the whim of staffers who tend to have political science degrees and not necessarily computer science degrees. So that ended up empowering lobbyists. So sometimes even a small investment in the infrastructure of expertise ends up having a big empowering effect on good policy decisions. Because if you rely on lobbyists to explain to you what something is, you're going to get, a certain kind of vision of how it works. So that's the Office of Technology Assessment, which was partially refunded last year, but only a very small amount that I interpret it as a foot in the door, but hopefully we'll see it reinstated.
So our time is almost up. In order to get to the questioners that are up, could I ask that we just go through all the questions, and then we'll have one final round of comment, and then we'll close. So why don't we start with Mike on my right?
Thanks. Karina, I decided to come up. My name is Daniel Bennett, and just wanted to let people know, first of all, that Congressional Management Foundation is coming out with their final report on communicating with Congress, which I hope will help Congress to use the internal standard that they have, open it up for the outside so that people can more easily communicate, especially through advocacy groups. So I think that standard will be helpful. And then the other one is that the Library of Congress has opened up the standard for how to put a bill in a URL, and that now is public. And so that my question is, with the possibility of having all this information out there, the need or the desire for open standards so that going through 100 terabytes of data is much more easy, and that people can more easily grab the data in programmatic ways, having government participate in standards and welcome the public in to talk about what these standards might be, or at least know what the inside government is using, I think might be very helpful.
Great question. Thank you. Let's go to the center mic.
I got two questions. When will we see our first user-generated, wiki-produced piece of legislation? Not just getting input from people out there, but actually producing a piece of legislation that's taken on by Congress and passes. When will we see that? And the number two question I have is proprietary data and privacy data. For users to truly engage with an open government, they'll need to see some of the proprietary data from companies and private data from individuals. What will it take for companies and individuals to give that up? So if you could kind of speak to that. Thank you.
Okay, good questions. And very last questioner.
Hi, I'm David James with Insight, and I had a question regarding voting systems and how they're designed. I see people in government looking at sites like Dig, and they think, wow, Dig's so popular, and you almost give it a lot of credibility. But I think about Dig and think, well, it's only one way to bring together a diverse group's preferences. And I was curious to see the panel's thoughts about different ways of kind of bringing the public's insight up, because I don't think Dig is the only way, and I think it can be gamed like we talked about here. And personally, I'm a fan of seeing a bunch of different systems, not where any one becomes dominant, where they all play a role, and that way it's harder to game any one of them. And I know Google has a lot of thoughts about avoiding gaming of the system. I'd like to hear their thoughts as well.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll do one last sort of round of comments. We have a smorgasbord of questions about the standards process, user-generated legislation, access to proprietary data, and how you weight opinion or votes, if you want to call them that. And if you want to address any or all of those, why don't we start with you, John, and we'll go down the line.
Okay, I guess I'll talk about the tools for mass collaboration, because that's something I find particularly interesting. And this might be surprising, but I actually want to defend poorly designed systems of mass collaboration. So if you think about a room or this room that has corners, and if you sit by the microphone, then you're more likely to have been able to ask a question. So those are actually natural features of how we interact. And so when you're online, if you're at the bottom of a 5,000 comment thread, you might, if you're shy, talk to the person whose comment is next to you and start to reply more. So I don't think the ideal thing for comment threads is the best comment to immediately go to the top. I mean, that's desirable, but I think it's a little bit more complex than that in a way that reflects how people actually interact with each other. And discovering that, like I said before, is going to take experimentation.
On that point, I think there are a lot of also hidden things. I think it's possible tomorrow to see the first HJ Res bill completely wiki-generated formed. But that doesn't require OMB, that doesn't require legislative council, that doesn't require everything. So I think you're gonna see things slowly developing where more and more input, valuable bilateral communication input is happening. But recognize there are a lot more steps in the process than you might naturally assume.
I'm not sure if my comment responds to any of the questions, but it's sort of the thoughts that came to me when I was hearing questions. One is that, one of the problems with what happens in Washington is that it all happens here in Washington. There's benefits to living here, right? We don't have to go rent the $1,000 hotel room to be here for the inauguration. And, we sort of get to talk to people who are in the know. When you're somewhere else in the country, it's very hard to get the package of information together that you need to do things and to have an impact. And so the packaging aspect, expecting agencies to put the full grouping of information that's important, or expecting Congress to do it, it seems to me is really important. And that's something that I think that there could be a lot of participation on, the sort of demanding that kind of input. Now, when you get to things like could legislation be written, on a wiki, the problem is you sort of need all the lobbyists who are around Washington already to learn how to use those tools, because they're really going to insist that they have some role, and they have useful things to say. Just because they're not tech proficient doesn't mean they might have some good ideas. So I think that some of that's generational, and that might kind of evolve.
Yeah, my final comment, I think the idea of a wiki-generated law is pretty cool. I would say that, the likelihood of it depends on whether or not the powers that be like what's being generated. But I think that one of the things that's going to be the precursor to something like that happening is there's got to be some type of cooling off period for legislation where something gets posted online, you at least have maybe an hour or maybe 24 hours to 3 days. There's been all sorts of proposals that float out there that say a bill should at least be out there before Congress votes on it, so that the public can have at least a few minutes to see what the Congress is voting on. And only if that happens, then you're going to start seeing wiki participation. But there's no chance of it happening until there's at least a decision of what the topics are and what the votes are going to be on.
All right, well, let's end the panel there. We'll reconvene in 4 years through cyber avatars, where we will collectively congratulate ourselves on all of the wiki-generated legislation and government data on which it was based. So let me say thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for clicking if you're on YouTube. See you at the next one.